Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for the next installment in the Grenzebach Lear & Associates webinar series, Practical Solutions for Post-Recession Staff Momentum. Today's webinar is presented by Gregory Leet, Vice President. Gregory joined the firm in 2010, bringing nearly 20 years of experience in higher education advancement. Most recently, Gregory held the position of Vice President of Development with the Arizona State University Foundation, where he oversaw the university's fundraising operations, managed a staff of 70, tripled prospect appointments, and led efforts for a planned $1.3 billion campaign. Gregory has also held senior fundraising and management positions with Creighton University and with Kansas State University. Today's session will explore the challenges associated with managing a talented, productive development program in the current economic landscape. Gregory welcomes any questions you have during today's session, and will answer those questions in the time remaining at the end of the hour. To address a question to him, please use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. Select All Participants from the drop-down menu and send us your questions. Any questions we do not have a chance to answer today will be addressed in a follow-up message we send next week. Tomorrow afternoon, we will send a recording of the session along with the presentation slides, as well as a short survey to gain your feedback. Thank you once again for joining us today. I will now turn it over to Gregory to get us started.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and good morning, everybody from Phoenix, Arizona. I want to thank you for finding the time to join us today to have a little conversation about what's been going on with the economy the last couple of years and the effects it's had on our abilities to lead and manage our teams. And we are hoping that everybody that's in the Midwest and the East Coast and the Maritime provinces has been able to stay safe the last 24 to 48 hours with the hard weather back there. So our thoughts are with you, and hope you're managing to get through that safely and without any unnecessary strains and stress. Also joining us today, I just want to acknowledge my colleague, Heather McCown. Heather will be in the background today helping me move the slides through, so thank you for your assistance, Heather. I appreciate that. I also would like to advise everybody just to apologize in advance. I am fighting a cold, and so if that impedes my voice a little bit, please indulge me. So let's go to our next slide, Heather, and begin our conversation today about what has happened over the last 2 or 3 years in regard to the economic downturn and the effects it has had on our teams, as well as, important to note, our donors and prospects. Interestingly, the government officials tell us that the recession officially ended in June of '09, and although that may be what the calculations show, I would hazard a guess that probably most of us would feel that the feedback that we receive from the field would indicate that not many people are feeling the end of the recession at this point. Certainly, we've experienced a lessening of the downturn, and people may believe we're at the bottom, but this recession is clearly going to take some time to climb out. And so it poses us as leaders and managers of advancement operations with some unique challenges in managing our teams and in helping to coach and advise them in how they work with their prospects. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through here today. Donations we see have dropped as much as 11% to some of the largest charities in the country. And one of the interesting data points here is we look at this slide that Heather has brought up that shows total giving across all nonprofit sectors going back to 1969. And as we can see in the far right-hand part of the graph, it's very clear that this particular downturn has had a very significant and measurable impact on the amount of charitable giving that has taken place over the last 3 years. But rather than focusing on the negative dimension of that, I think what I'd like to point out in this slide is that as we look back in time to the other gray bars, which reflect other recessionary periods, even in cases where there was a fairly significant decline, as we saw back in the 2001 period, and then all the way back in the early 70s. I think the important takeaway here is how the giving drew itself out of that period, and if you look at the long-term trend line, it is clearly an upward trend line. So even during significant downturns, philanthropic support has found a way to recover from that downturn and go on to exceed the highs that had preceded the recession. In our next slide, that Heather, could you please bring up, it's the same information that you just saw in the bar graph, but here we have it represented instead numerically to help draw the distinctions and the trends a little more clearly, I think. This data is presented to us in inflation-adjusted dollars. And I think as we look at this, you see the very hard facts of what's gone on since 2007 in terms of the percentage of decline, which is quite acute. But again, in inflation-adjusted dollars, you can look back to the early and mid-70s and see that as a percentage of decline, there were also very significant declines in the past from which we recovered. These two slides are really just to provide us with some context as it relates to the dynamics that we are facing. And I know as some of us are working with teams that may have members that are much earlier in their career, maybe even in some cases just getting started in their nonprofit careers and as fundraisers, they may not have this perspective of the business cycles and the effects those cycles have on our ability to solicit and successfully achieve philanthropic support. So we offer these slides as a way to provide some of that perspective. So as you work with your teams, there's a way to put this into context and hopefully help them keep some perspective in their work. So let's go to our next slide. And what we at the firm are calling the new normal. And the new normal is really just a way to characterize the fact that the frame has been reset as a result of this recession. It certainly has had some effects. And as we talk through those effects here today, I'll refer to it in a number of occasions as the new normal. And what we see here is that gifts for capital purposes in the broad definition of capital, which would include endowments, we've seen the declines, but similar to declines that have happened in previous recessions, anywhere from 31 to 37% in any individual institution. Another dynamic of the new normal is the continued erosion in the percentage of alumni participation. That slide has been going on for some time. We've seen that the recession may have accelerated that slide a little bit. However, there are some bright spots in the new normal, and I think one of them we've seen here, particularly in the equity markets. The stock market in 2009 and 2010, and certainly here at the early stages of 2011, has made very significant recovery from the precipitous drops that were in 2008. I believe I just saw some data a few days ago that in January of 2011, the percentage increase of the equity markets in that 1 month alone was the strongest start to a new year in approximately 14 years. So this particular piece of information, I think, is, again, just allowing us to consider the new normal, where on one hand we have high unemployment, a pervasive sense of an economy that is struggling, but at the same time we see that wealth in real terms of equity is increasing and recovering to measurements that predate the recession. Another new normal dynamic that we see here with GG&A is that money seems to be flowing back into donor-advised funds, and we've seen some of our clients have had the tenacity to move forward with planning donor-advised fund programs even during the course of this recession, and dollars do seem to be flowing back there. So Heather, our next slide, please. And here I just thought I'd try to add what is my probably weak attempt at some humor, that the new normal might really just be reminding ourselves that the go-go, bang-bang years are not the normal, and that the new normal means resetting our expectations a little bit. So let's go to our next slide. And let me talk a little bit about some of the things that we are seeing here at Grenzebach Lear & Associates overall as we look at the broad spectrum of clients that we have, which include everything from higher education to the healthcare industry, as well as many of the country and North America's high-profile nonprofits, culture, and arts organizations. We surveyed our clients in January 2010, about 200 clients, to collect some data that we thought would be important for us to make sure that we were keeping a close pulse. And true to form, you know, we did see the total fundraising commitments, cash and new pledges were down approximately 29% overall. But very important to note here is that of the responding institutions, 34% were reporting gains in their charitable contributions in 09 versus 08. We think that's an important leading indicator. And if looking at just cash in the door, that aggregated decline was 8%, but again, 34% of the institutions were reporting growth versus the prior year in cash in the door. Another graphic in our next slide that I think helps to drive this point home is looking at the nonprofit sector written large, so this would include all segments of the sector, looking at how charities fared in 2010. This is pretty recent data as a measurement over 09. The top bar shows us that 23.7% of nonprofit charities saw an increase in charitable giving that was greater than 20%. That's a very significant number. If we drop all the way down to the middle part of the graph, where we see about the same as 2009, where we had 10.2%, we can see that there's a fairly significant number of nonprofits, again, written large, that are experiencing gains. And I think that's an important fact to remember as we try to work with our teams and keep things, again, in context and allow them not to be, and to help, frankly, protect them from being overly beaten down by the media, which tends to accentuate the more dismal aspects of what's going on in the economy. In our next slide about the new normal, I love this quote that was given by Barton Landis at the Foundation for the Carolinas. And I think it's a great metaphor for what's going on. The economy caused a very abrupt and sudden freeze in many aspects related to financial planning and financial decisions, and it froze lock hard. But what we are beginning to see is that the thawing out has begun to occur, and like any thaw, it doesn't happen abruptly. It is a process that sort of unfolds where the flow begins to increase at an increasing rate. And I thought that Mr. Landis' comment here was a good one to help drive that point home. We are beginning to see that thaw, and it seems to be thawing across all sectors of the nonprofit profession. In our next slide, though, I think one of the things that we're trying to remind our clients, and what we're actually hearing from our clients in some cases, is that flat is maybe the new up for the short term. Going back to that humor slide I had earlier in the presentation about the value of $100, what we are seeing is that maybe it's a matter of adjusting our expectations, that we are not going to see, at least in the short run, quick upturns of significant proportions similar to what we saw before the recession hit. And so maybe a measurement of our success is steady as she goes, and to not see an erosion, but to just be able to hold our own from where we were in the previous year. In the next slide, Heather, I wanted to talk for a moment just about the changes that are occurring in the mindsets of our donors and prospects. And I think this is really where the rubber begins to hit the road for our teams. Donors are definitely more wary now. They are focusing on the institutions with whom they already have relationships, and they are asking harder questions. We have seen a change in the kinds of vehicles that donors are willing to consider in the way that they make their decisions and their contributions. And one of the trends that we see is bridge gifts, and that is the concept, of course, where rather than making one significant large commitment to an endowment, many donors are now looking to make smaller annual commitments over a number of years equal to the amount of income that would have been spun off from that endowment had the endowment gift been made. And I wanted to bring this idea forward for those who may not have been considering this, that this might be a way to work with your donors in the new normal in a way that allows them to make a smaller commitment, maintain their connection to you, keep the idea of what the larger endowment would support in dialogue without being insensitive to their caution at the moment about making that larger commitment. Donors are clearly exercising more due diligence. They're taking longer to make decisions. They're asking more questions. They're seeking more advice both from us as fundraisers as well as their own trusted advisors, which of course adds to that decision timeline. And they are more often than not looking for a tangible return, something where we can demonstrate the impact of their philanthropy on our institutions. They are thinking more like investors. But as our next slide shows, at GG&A, we are quite optimistic going forward. Excuse me. While we do think that bigger gifts are clearly fewer at the moment, we're quite confident that they will return, and there may be some early indications that that is beginning to happen. And as with any challenge, it's a test of leadership, and we find that leaders who are willing to be innovative and look for ways to accomplish more with less are the ones who are being the most successful right now. And I would hope that your participation in our webinar today is a good sign that you are, in fact, one of those kinds of leaders, or you would not be spending time with us today as we talk through some of these dynamics. In the next slide, another reason for our optimism, I think, is that in talking with fundraisers directly, there's optimism there. They are looking to see that the 2010-2011 academic year will be an improved year over the previous year. And this is an index that CASE has recently come out with called the CFI, CASE Fundraising Index. And it's only been in existence for a few years, but in the short time that it's been around, it has done a very good job of being a leading indicator of what has actually been borne out through the course of the year. The numbers may not hit exactly right, but the general trend certainly has been on board. So we see this as a sign of a reason for optimism. And of course, the fundraisers are, in fact, those who are closest to our constituencies and in dialogue with them. So listening to what is coming from their thinking based on field experience is an important consideration as we go forward. In the next slide, we talk a little bit more about what is being shown in the CFI. And it seems that education fundraisers are the most optimistic for the giving to increase with colleges and schools and universities. And as I mentioned, this is a survey of fundraisers, which is actually done twice a year. In the most recent year, the fundraisers predicted a 5.7% return, or excuse me, increase in giving this year over the previous academic year. And if we look at what those fundraisers were predicting in 2009 for a 4.3% increase over in 2010, we did see that trend line hold through. So we think this may be certainly an indicator to be aware of and pay a little attention to. In our next slide, we talk just a little bit more about the fundraising index and having fundraisers who feel confident about the financial circumstances in which they operate is, I think, an improvement over what we've seen in the last 2 years. And as we have indicated, because fundraisers are the ones spending the most time in the field, in my own estimation, I find that to be a pretty significant barometer. Let's go to our next slide, Heather, and talk just a little bit more about why we are optimistic and why I think as leaders it's important to absorb this sense of optimism in our responsibilities to lead our teams. We're optimistic because although we realize that donors are recognizing that these are tough times, they are responding, although certainly more selectively. The rebound in the capital and equity markets has restored some wealth, and we think that although Main Street unemployment and profits are still a factor, the fact that people can look at their stock holdings or their retirement funds and see that wealth coming back there is something that will eventually buoy confidence in their decisions to make financial commitments. But we do think, although we are optimistic, we believe that the largest risk is for our clients to fail to recognize the increased donor diligence that is underway, or to make the very serious error of pulling horns in too much and failing to ask. Although the decisions to make commitments may be prolonged at this point, not having that dialogue or being afraid to make the next move can be a very significant error. In the next slide about optimism, I thought this was an interesting case study that I came across at Boston University in a way that they were very proactive and deliberate in trying to find a way to bolster their own optimism. Now, Boston University is a large university with alumni all over the world, and they were very sage in recognizing that the recession that we've experienced in North America is not being experienced necessarily in the same way in other parts of the world. And so BU went out and worked with alumni in other parts of the world as a way to really accomplish two things. One, maybe offset some of the delayed decisions of philanthropy for their North American-based alumni and supporters, but also as a deliberate way and a strategy to build optimism inside of its teams, knowing that working with prospects and donors who are still willing to move forward in their relationship building and decision making for gifts is a way to keep the teams motivated and elevated as well. And I think they are to be applauded for making that strategic decision. Now, certainly we don't all have international alumni everywhere, but the fact that Boston University was willing to be deliberate and creative as a way to work through this period, I think is the larger point that I hope we can take away from that. So what are some of the memorable lessons that we've learned in this recession? And in our next slide, we talk about some of those. And I think that one of the memorable lessons are the absurdly aggressive goals that some organizations have laid out there, that there was almost a bubble for philanthropic goal setting in the same way that there was a bubble in the real estate market. There was no limit to the up. And I think that we've recognized through this recession that that truth may in fact not be a truth, and that setting aggressive goals is something that needs to be questioned more thoughtfully and strategically during the planning process for campaigns. We should be asking ourselves, we think, why should our next campaign goal be higher? Is that realistic? Do we believe that the market that we are engaged with can support that? We think another memorable lesson is, what rules are we counting by? Are we more worried about cash in the door? Is that the goal? Are we more concerned about the long-term commitments? Are we looking at this from an accounting perspective, or are we looking at this from a relationship perspective? And I think another memorable lesson is, are we able to shift and rethink our frames, our point of references about the initiatives that our institutions have launched in a way that will really unlock more generous giving? And can we still make our institutions successful with their philanthropy in a public way that we can talk about with pride and with legitimacy? Let's go to our next slide, Heather. So what are some of the other enduring truths? And I think one thing that we have seen is that, in a way, everything old is new again. And by that we mean that the fundamental truths about the business that we are in, which is building relationships, hasn't changed. Irrespective of the wealth that any individual donor has or the general trend line in the economy, we still have core principles and core activities that we need to be engaged in as fundraising and advancement teams, and that namely is to build relationships, to recognize that by practicing transparency, we build trust, and in building trust, we create an environment that facilitates investment, that we need to define and demonstrate a precise and powerful impact for all of the gifts that come to our institutions. What still works, of course, is asking. If we are not doing that, we really are missing the most fundamental element of our work. And then also, finally, being accountable beyond the expectations of our donors. In other words, are we exceeding what they expect in terms of the way we handle their gifts and the stewardship they receive for those investments? So let's talk a little bit about getting back to the basics, because I really think that is one of the most effective ways to work through this and keep our teams motivated. And that means focusing our attention on the fundamental building blocks that we know are important to our work. And in this next slide, I believe that one of the most fundamental elements of our work is looking at the portfolios of our gift officers and making sure that we actually are executing on the moves management of those portfolios. It's very tempting in an environment of uncertainty, and certainly early on in this recession, almost an environment of fear. It's very tempting to just not make the next move. We'll just back off right now, and we'll just wait a little bit. And I would argue that that is actually a terrible error. Moves management is not an abstract theory. It really is the basis of our business plans. We can't hope that things are going to work out with our donors and call that a strategy. And we can't wonder and guess what our donors and prospects are thinking and call that communication. We have to actually be in communication, and in that dialogue, we can craft and revise our strategies in a way that will lead ultimately to that philanthropic decision. It's also important to have team and individual goals. That is about as fundamental as it gets. And I think one of the trends that we see in philanthropy is more and more goal setting around teams, collecting and connecting individual goals to the larger picture in a way that people begin to recognize that they each have a stake in each other's work. Going on to the next slide, more about the basics. As managers, I think it's very important for us to have clear and documented expectations that everybody is aware of, up and down the line, across all the different parts of the fundraising operation. The folks in the annual fund need to be aware of what's going on in major gifts. Major gifts teams need to be aware of the goals and objectives that are happening in estate and gift planning or principal gifts. So I think it's important to make sure that we take a quick look at our prospect pools and make sure that the portfolios are within the ranges that we believe are most manageable. It can be tempting in a recession to either try to blow these up really large, try to cover more territory, cover more individuals, or to shrink them way down out of a hesitancy to be out there in the marketplace. And I think, just as a reminder here, some of the ranges that we find to be most manageable and a lot of institutions are displayed here on the slide. We think it's important to remember the basic of setting appropriate reward systems, both the formal ones, which of course happen with our annual reviews, and I know many of us are deep in the planning process right now for performance evaluations and setting annual plans for the next fiscal year, but also in the informal ways that we recognize members on our teams when they're successful. So a question to ask yourself, I think, as a leader and as a manager is, how are you celebrating the successes, however you're defining them, but how are you celebrating those successes in a way that bolsters the whole team? Because having that continuous improvement and that feedback that it gets elicited when we celebrate success can be very important for you as a manager. And although nobody likes to talk about the poor performers, we all know that they're out there, and we all know that we've had them or will have them or have had them. Having clear consequences for how we address those issues and consistently applying those is a basic element of any manager in any profession, and certainly no less true for us in the fundraising world. In our next slide, in reinforcing and communicating the basics, looking at the factors that contribute to that success, having those performance standards, and addressing potential challenges that certainly have erupted up and down the lines of our teams. Stand on the foundation of your portfolio tracking, as we were saying about moves management. Pay very close attention to the proposal's activity. I think a range that most clients seem to be comfortable with, and one that I think makes a lot of sense, is that anywhere from 50% to 65% of proposals can be turned into commitments. And I think when the range starts spreading out in either end, away from that middle zone, you might have a couple of things going on there. So to ask yourself, if the range gets a lot higher than that, then, you know, are the fundraisers being insufficiently aggressive? And on the other hand, if it's much lower than that, are they just throwing proposals out there willy-nilly just to get proposals out the door without really worrying about their close ratio? Remembering the earlier slide that we had of the river thawing out, recognizing that the donors and the prospects are in fact thawing out is important, but it also means that we need to be willing to talk to them and find out where their mindsets are at this time. Measuring the frontline fundraiser activity up and down the line is clearly a basic. And having, as we said earlier, individual and team goals, I think, is a great way to keep collaboration alive in our organizations and to make sure that people don't retreat into their silos. In our next slide, we talk a little bit about some of the productivity measures. Again, these are the basics, but I think it's important to refresh our thinking, or at least remind ourselves about where we need to be with these as we work with our teams to make sure that we haven't drifted off the center beam here. So in the principal gifts area, we find that 6 contacts a month seems to be, with some of our more successful clients, the major gifts somewhere in the 15 contacts, lead gifts into the annual fund, 18 contacts. But I think the more important point here in regard to the basics and communicating those is that as the goals are set, making sure that one team is as aware of the other team's goals as possible, trying to have a sense of team accountability and team success. Paying attention to the development of the proposals, how they're written, and paying, of course, close attention to stewardship and donor relations. Another thing that I think some organizations maybe have lost sight of is the fact that although we pay a lot of attention to our moves management and portfolio composition, there's nothing quite like the opportunity that comes with a quality referral. And to build an expectation for referrals, set that as a goal with frontline fundraisers, and as you talk with them about their portfolio, think about prospects who might be running in circles of individuals who are also having success at this moment, because certainly there are prospects that are building significant wealth during this time, even though there is a recession, and trying to leverage those relationships to find other people of similar interests and business success that might have an interest in learning what's happening with our institutions. Birds of a feather do flock together, and if you have prospects who are continuing to move forward in their decision-making for gift decisions, the odds are those folks are also connected to other people that are in a similar financial situation, or may be. So talking about setting goals in our next slide, I believe as managers, one of the challenges that we do face is a reluctancy to adapt as circumstances change. So I would ask us to consider whether we're willing to adjust our expectations midstream. We put a lot of work into establishing goals for the calendar year or for the fiscal year, and sometimes those get set in stone in many ways. And I would challenge us to say that it may be important to be willing to have some discomfort now for an honest conversation about whether those goals need to be adjusted in one way or another, rather than waiting until the end of the year when maybe there hasn't been that kind of a dialogue, or there's been an unwillingness to make adjustments, and suddenly the final numbers are very different from what the goals have been set to be, and creating some very dangerous disappointment, pardon me, some dangerous disappointment with our executive leaders. Asking your frontline fundraisers to solicit around 70% of their target population is a good goal. Of course, that's always going to shift a little bit, but making this a selected strategic decision about what population within their total pool of prospects are able to be solicited is an important goal to have in front of them and for you to hold them accountable to. And as you've heard me say here several times this morning, because I believe very deeply in this, and we see a trend in this area with our clients, having our development officers work across teams with other fundraisers is something that actually can be built as an expectation and setting a goal. Some do it naturally, and I would argue that many of them we see as our most successful fundraisers. So let's take a lesson from that page and reestablish that as a goal, that that's an expectation within your organizations, that people will work together, and nothing gets people working together more quickly than having a common goal that works across teams. Deciding what those goals will be, of course, is something that will require you to be creative and to dialogue probably with some of your colleague managers and leaders, but I think that's time well spent. Other ways that we can measure success, which show up in our next slide, are expanding the evaluation of what criteria, or expanding which criteria we evaluate. In addition, for things like the number of contacts beyond simply one-to-one visits, but looking for trend lines in email contacts and phone calls. Making sure that there's a metric for qualification visits. It's always important to be building our pipeline, and frankly, those are fun visits for fundraisers to go out there and make a new relationship. So measuring that and looking for those referrals in that prospect qualification work, as we mentioned earlier, birds of a feather flocking together. Paying attention to the number of strategies that are developed and documented, looking for asks toward identified priorities versus those over the transom, looking for a balance there maybe, not forgetting not overlooking the ones that do come in more unexpected ways or discounting their values somehow. Looking for the total number of dollars that are solicited, how many gifts are closed, independent of what the actual yield amount was. And back to the team idea, giving credit and measuring success based on the degree to which your fundraisers are assisting other members of the team in the work that they do. So what do we do next? In the next slide, and we'll move right on to the next one from here, Heather. This really starts with you as the leader. Motivating the team, motivating the front line, motivating the support staff, all begins with you as the boss. So as a leader and as a manager, it's important to remember, as uncomfortable as it can be sometimes, that the spotlight is on you every day, all day. So challenge yourselves to ask, are you living up to the expectations that you have for yourself and being a motivating source for your teams? Are you modeling the attitude and the behaviors that you expect from your teams? Are you the poster child for those yourself? Can they look to you in your day-to-day dealings for examples and inspiration? Tap into your credibility. Your credibility as somebody who has been there and done that before can be a tremendous catalyst for success in helping to bring others along with you. Not being afraid to do something differently or to encourage, or new will help to encourage others to do the same. It's very easy to say, well, Bill, as frontline fundraiser, I think you need to think differently about that and how you're working with that prospect. But they are looking to see if we're doing the same thing in our standard business practices as well. And looking for those opportunities that are out there, it's easy to be intimidated by the threat of failure. But as a leader and as a manager, you have risen to those positions because you are able to harness that inhibition or fear and take advantage of opportunities. So don't quit doing that. Keep rising up to that challenge. In our next slide, we see some lessons in the for-profit sector. So what are some of the qualities that we can demonstrate that help to provide motivation for our team? Well, clearly, optimism is very important. Having a hopeful spirit, expressing that optimism in a way that people can hear it and see it in the way you do your work, the tone of your emails, the tone of your hallway interactions, how you address groups and meetings. There are all ways that these qualities are exuded for the positive or for the negative. Talking about your credibility, don't be afraid to reach back into your past and talk about experiences that you've had that can be lessons for today. It adds credibility to you, and frankly, it's fun to tell stories about things that we've done in the past. Demonstrating your competency. This is when leaders are tested. When there are challenging times, we have to rise up to that. So access your competency and stand on that competency. In this day and age, I do believe that there has been a shift in the office culture and in organizational behavior where there is an expectation that leaders and managers have authentic empathy and a care for their teams. So the question to ask ourselves as managers, are we able to express that in ways that people can see it and feel it? And of course, maybe one of the most important elements of our work as leaders and managers is being balanced and fair in our decision making. And that is a challenge. We all have situations that we try to avoid. We all have people that we prefer to be around. And so it's important to make sure that we ask ourselves this little reality check on a routine basis about whether we are being fair and balanced in our dealings with others, the way we implement policies, and the way we act out on the procedures of our teams. So in our next slide, we talk a little bit about communication and using that supportive communication so that we are creating that kind of an atmosphere. In using the language and the tone, let's talk about problems and solutions and not talk about people and personalities. Be specific in your dialogue, not general. Generalizations leave a lot of room for interpretation, and I can guarantee you, and I'm sure many of you have examples of this yourself, generalizations let people interpret, and those interpretations will often be far from the mark of what you intended. Build on your past success. When things do happen that are clearly an accomplishment, feature them in a way that you can extrapolate that to the broader goals of the organization. Connect the dots for people. We often assume that they'll do that on their own, and I think that it is very helpful when we can do that for them as leaders and to provide the context of why that success was important to our overall goals. Be accountable to your team yourself. Have your own voice and be the owner of your messages. We are not simply the conduit for the executive branch. Those executive leaders clearly have ideas and we do communicate them, but we are seen as the architects of the direction of our organizations in our management and leadership roles. And so avoiding language like we or they and using I and me allows people to know that you're accountable to them. Make sure there's two-way communication. Look for the feedback. When you're outlining challenges and problems, do it descriptively in a non-biased way. Don't be judgmental or use pejorative terms. Allow things to be put in front of folks in a way that doesn't signal a bias or a preference. Be quick to validate other people in teams. Always be known as someone who shares credit. That will come back in so many positive ways, and it fosters an environment that is supportive. In the next slide, I think that one thing I really would like to emphasize is the challenge that we face as leaders of not giving in to the doom and gloom ourselves. It's so easy to buy into the media's drumbeat of negativity, but we have a responsibility to our teams to be positive and upbeat and to recognize that we are a source of that positivity for our teams. We know that the markets are volatile, that they expand and they contract, and that they can pause philanthropic decisions, but we need to show that that is something we understand and recognize, and it's not throwing us off the rails as a result. Set targets, stay the course, and as we pointed out in our very first slide today, use the context of 40 years of data that we have in studying the nonprofit marketplace, that there is a context for this that allows us to have perspective and to not fold our cards psychologically and give in to that doom and gloom. Make sure that every effort that we make is about donor-centered stewardship, build and broaden those relationships, and look for opportunities to stay in touch with our current donors. In the next slide, I think in terms of working with your teams, make sure that they are able to talk about the ways that your institution has responded to the economy. Have you given them talking points that relate directly to the fiscal decisions that your institutions have made, whatever those are? Be able to demonstrate to your team so that they can demonstrate to their constituencies ways that your organization has tried to tighten its belt without sacrificing its mission. That's actually a very inspirational story. Donors understand and they recognize that our institutions have had to retrench. Be able to talk about what you have done so that they, meaning the donors and your teams, hear from us and not from somewhere else. Put your fundraisers in a position to be a resource to their prospects and donors rather than a reactor to what they hear from the prospects and donors. And be aware of the need to segment your messages. The way we communicate, let's say, for instance, with our parents that may be supporting institutions might be very different from the way your fundraisers need to communicate with their donors. And to recognize that those messages can be nuanced in ways that will allow the institution to be successful, but we have to put that nuance into the hands of our fundraisers so that they know how to handle different kinds of constituents at different points in time. So what's the impact of doing these things on the donors themselves? And on our next slide, we talk about that impact. So what are some of the success strategies for your teams? Emphasize the need for proactive visits. Do not hesitate to make the next move in the moves management strategy for that prospect just because we are uncertain about what might happen in that dialogue. Don't assume that those prospect situation is of a certain character. We're surprised pleasantly all the time when we have dialogues with our fundraisers from the stories they tell us about donors who have a circumstance quite different from what we thought going in. So make sure that your teams know that it's important not to presume what's going to happen in that dialogue. Remind them how important it is to listen and how important it is to ask. Don't let them succumb to the fear that asking somehow has become inappropriate because there's a recession. The decision may in fact be delayed, as we discussed, but asking is what stimulates that conversation to find out where the prospect's thinking is at the moment. Remind your teams to listen and then remind them to listen some more. That listening is going to allow them to be much more effective in how they work forward to close the gift. In the next slide, just to emphasize again, the need to be sensitive to the timing of those donors. Staying close to those who have supported you in the past, knowing that they're the ones that are the most important stakeholders. Continuing to solicit. Remembering that when donors are ready to re-engage, we need to be there when they come to that decision or come to that condition. And the only way we can be there to know that they are now ready to re-engage is if we make sure our teams are in the field talking with our prospects and donors to know when that shift has occurred. Be strategic about the time frames of how they move through their prospect portfolios and make sure that the constituents have opportunities to give, even if it might be different from what was originally envisioned in the strategy that you set for the prospect. And very importantly, in working with your teams, make sure that your frontline fundraisers are able to cross-sell. If the current strategy needs to be adapted because the prospect can't move forward on that, can something else be inserted into the conversation about deferred giving or some kind of unrestricted support or initiatives that are underway in a different part of the institution? Don't leave opportunities on the table, and don't let your fundraisers leave opportunities on the table because they're not able to cross-sell to other opportunities that are inside your institutions. In the next slide, as I said earlier about communicating to your prospect or donor base the way your institution has responded to the economy, being able to talk about in specific ways that the belt tightening has occurred without compromising quality and services and making sure that they don't hear it elsewhere. I think I may have inadvertently repeated this slide there. I'm sorry about that. Moving on to the next slide, I think that in having these dialogues and asking your frontline fundraisers to be in communication with their portfolio, our missions haven't changed despite the economic downturn. And so even though donors may have hesitated, we still have very important and impactful stories to tell, and making sure that your frontline is in a position to be able to talk about the fact that the mission has not shifted, that global problems are still needing significant research and bright minds, that the young people that our institutions work with or the supporters of our institutions continue to need our services and our resources. And that hasn't changed despite the economy. And as I said earlier, be sure to get out there and talk with the donors who have made gifts in the past to maintain that stewardship. So what are 10 lessons that we can say that we've learned through this period, or maybe learned again? Well, clearly you cannot stop asking. Those institutions and organizations that dialed back here are the ones that are being hurt the most right now. Knowing that there is always volatility in the market, and it always slows down decisions, and it has weakened our ability to get large multi-year pledges concluded, but it hasn't stopped those dialogues from happening. We have to remind our investors and our donors about the value of everything. We have to be thoughtful about our philanthropists. We need to be aware that they have become tougher in the way they make their decisions. They are much more exacting. And so we have to make the case over and over and reconceive it and sharpen it and make it more compelling than it ever has been in the past. But crises also provide opportunities. We are able to prune. We're able to reorganize. In some cases, we're actually able to reallocate and reshift our investing in our budgets. It provides an environment where people get it and recognize that there is a need for change. And so if you have change that you'd like to make, you often are more able to move that forward now. And understanding that when there are profound challenges, as there have been over the last couple of years, it gives you an opportunity to work on those sacred cows that up until now may not have been touchable. In our next slide, in our last slide before questions and answers, recognize that in these kinds of economies that infrastructure costs and inefficient practices are a much better target for finding ways to downsize than cutting into your human capital. Those who have either made decisions to let go of frontline staff or who chose not to refill them are clearly ones that are struggling now. Donors want to see prudent management, and when they do, they want to invest more and feel better about it. So show how we're being prudent. Recognize that leadership donors in particular, those who are on our brochures, who give us the testimonials and are willing to be exemplars, they have moved to thinking about matching and challenge gifts as a way to leverage their investment. Most donors do stay loyal if we give them compelling reasons to be. So a question for us as managers, what are we doing to show that we are worthy of their support? And as we've said all morning long here, stewardship is just essential and maybe even more important than we ever thought, and we certainly never thought it wasn't important. And then last but not least, during hard times and challenging times, you learn a lot about the character of your team, who the leaders are and who the whiners are. But recognize also that your teams are learning about your character as well. So with that, we've reached the conclusion of our slides, and I'm hoping that there's still some time for Q&A here. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kevin, who I believe has been collecting some of these questions.
Thank you so much, Gregory. We're going to open the virtual floor to questions now. Let's see, we have a first question. You mentioned that a fundraiser should explain how his or her institution has responded to the down economy. Is there a unique angle to this idea that can help donors want to give again?
Well, that's an interesting question, and what my quick response to that might be that, as I mentioned, tightening the belt of an institution really allows you to feature the mission of the institution, because that becomes center to all of those conversations about the adaptations that the organization has had to make. And so to the degree that we can reframe the dialogue with a prospect or a donor in terms about the mission of the institution and why that mission it matters and why it matters to the individual, I think is actually an opportunity that doesn't come along that often with a sense of urgency and passion that challenging times can create for us.
Great. So a second participant asked, what are some of GG&A's clients doing innovatively with stewardship to reconnect with past donors?
Well, I think that we probably don't have enough time to go through all the creative and innovative ways that people are trying to be connected with their past supporters, but I have seen a number of institutions that in the past may have sent out their stewardship reports, their annual or biannual stewardship reports by mail, have taken those back in-house and used those as an opportunity to create an appointment with the donor on the part of the frontline fundraiser. And I think that's a very wise move. Many institutions, of course, always do it that way all the time, but I think in a challenging environment, even ones that might have been stewardship reports that might have been more on an autopilot format creates a great opportunity to go out and actually talk with our supporters again. So I've seen some institutions make that change in their delivery system in order to open up opportunities to put a fundraiser in person in front of a benefactor.
Okay, I think we have time for one final question. This participant notes that she has someone on her team that has manifested great leadership qualities during the financial challenge, but she doesn't seem to have the budget to send this person to a continuing education conference. How should she keep this person motivated and show her willingness to invest in them?
That's a really great question, and I think that's a challenge that a lot of organizations have seen as leaders and managers have tried to find ways to hold on to the very best people. One thought I would have about that is that in cases where you aren't able to provide the financial resources to invest in continuing education, there almost always is a long list of projects that we are meaning to get to as managers and leaders, and for one reason or another, we simply aren't able to get to that issue. Turning that into a project that we might be able to delegate as a standalone issue or topic, and asking that individual that's demonstrating leadership to take that on as a short-range project and to frame it as a way for them to learn and grow, and that you're going to help coach them through that project management, might be a great way to reward them for what they're doing currently to be successful in demonstrating leadership, while at the same time providing them with an opportunity to grow in some of their skill sets and to learn from you directly as they work with you in a partnership to work through that issue.
Great. Thank you so much, Gregory. This concludes today's webinar. As we mentioned at the beginning, tomorrow afternoon we will send a recording of the session along with the presentation slides, as well as a short survey to gain your feedback. Thank you all for participating in our webinar.
Thank you, everyone.